Okay, so low bound was set to 0. Now high bound we want to adjust so that it doesn't affect the bristles. We just want to affect the neck of the toothbrush. Okay, we want to dial this in. So I'm going to enter in a more precise value. 0.75 looks good. And you can see that this curve comes up there. So now I can edit this curvature attribute, and I can bend the head of the toothbrush forward and backwards all I want to. Okay? Now these attributes I don't want the animator to touch, so I need to lock those except for the curvature. So I'm going to select those attributes by name, right click on them and say lock selected, and they turn kind of a gray color. And now I cannot alter those values. Okay, now I do want to translate this back so that the bend happens in the middle of the neck. Right there. It'll look just a little bit nicer if I do that. Okay, so I can go back to my curvature attribute, and there it is. Okay. Now I don't want this bend deformer to move. It should always stay right there. Okay, because I've adjusted its translates, its rotates, and its scale. So I can select all of these attributes, the translate, rotate, and scale attributes, and I can lock those. I'm going to turn off the visibility of this. I don't need to be able to see it. So I enter 1, and now that's done. Okay, that's the neck of the toothbrush. Well, let's add in another deformer. So we'll select the toothbrush. Go to Create Deformers, Nonlinear. We're going to do a Squash deformer. Again, in my channel box, if I select the Squash 1, I could rename it if I wanted to. But this one has a factor attribute, and the factor attribute is the one that's responsible for how much it's squashed or stretched. Okay? I only want this squash and stretch to affect the bristles. I don't even want it to affect the entire head of the toothbrush, only the bristles. Okay? That's the assignment. So first thing I need to do is move it into position. Oh, I missed it. Now it doesn't want me to select it. There it goes. Okay, so I'm going to move it up so that center is up with the bristles. Then I need to rotate it 90 degrees and make sure that's precise. And now I've squashed the entire toothbrush, right? Not what we wanted. Okay, so let's adjust my factor back to 0. So it hasn't affected it. And I'm going to move this so that it affects only these bristles. Okay, so now there's going to be a problem. Still affects the entire toothbrush. Well, the squash deformer also has the low bound and high bound attributes. So I need to get rid of the low bound. And that's more what I wanted, but it's affecting the handle. So we need to tell it not to affect the handle. So here's what we do. We go to our toothbrush, we go to Window, Relationships Editors, Deformer Sets. If we click on my squash deformer, it automatically on the right side selects the toothbrush geo. That means that it's affecting it. It's also affecting the bend 1 set. Okay? So I'm going to select the toothbrush geo or click on it, and it's actually going to remove it from the selection. So now, if I do this squash 1 and the factor, it's not going to affect any part of the toothbrush. Okay, that's okay for now. Now I need to switch to component mode, make a vertex selection and select just these vertices for the bristles of the toothbrush. Okay? And then I need to add those to the deformer set by clicking the plus sign in this relationship editor. Okay? So now my deformer, my squash deformer, affects only the bristles. Okay? So I've got that adjusted how I want to. We want the animator to be able to control the factor but nothing else. So we select all the attributes except for the factor. Right click, lock the selected, and now they can't change those. Okay? Now I need to select the squash handle, which is what we moved around and situated. I need to make sure it doesn't ever move either. Okay, so I'm going to select all the translate, rotate, scale attributes, right click, lock selected. I'm going to turn off the visibility of this thing. I'm going to lock that too. And now I've got my squash and my bend. Well, I can't really access those very well right now. I can click on the geometry of the toothbrush and then click on my squash deformer and control that, or I can click on my bend deformer and do that. I can do the combination of the two. But what happens if I use both of them at the same time? That's not what I want to have happen. It's moving with the bend deformer, is moving the geometry in and out of the space that the squash deformer controls. So there's a thing called the input channels or input information for anything in Maya. So if I right click on this mesh and I can go to inputs, I'm going to go to all inputs. Okay, and I can see my two nonlinear deformers. And now the order that these are in matters. Okay, there's a sequence that happens. So right now, the first thing that happens, it goes from the bottom of the list and then moves up. First thing that happens to this geometry is there's a tweak. Okay? Who knows what that is? We don't really care. Maya always has one on any object that has a deformer. But then it has the bend. So it does the bend, and then after it does the bend, it tries to do a squash. Well, if my bend moves the geometry out of the way of the squash, then the squash has no effect. So what I need to do is move the squash by middle mouse clicking on this nonlinear squash 1 and dragging it below bend 1. Okay, so now if I bend it forward or back, it doesn't matter, it stays deformed, and I can use the factor of my squash deformer and it's still going to work. Because in reality, when Maya is evaluating this mesh, it is squashing the bristles before it does the bend. Okay, it's kind of like a mathematical equation. You got to figure out this part before you can figure out this part. And that's what you're telling Maya to do when you change those inputs. Okay, so now what happens if I move my toothbrush? Okay, that's not good, right? That's not predictable behavior. So let me put it back to default. We need to create a control that will move this geometry around and the deformers so that the animator can move everything all together without having to see the deformers and create a predictable animation. So what I like to use are NURBS primitives circles for the most part. I'm going to put that up where I want it to be. And then I need to rename it. I'm going to call it toothbrush control. And I shorten control to CTRL. And I need to delete history on that. I need to freeze transformations on